The valley was quiet until the shouting began. A line of men emerged from the morning mist, moving across the hillside with sharpened wooden spears held tightly in their hands. Behind them came women gathering children, carrying whatever they could before disappearing into the trees. No castles stood nearby, no metal armor flashed in the sunlight. There were no kings giving orders, and yet everyone understood exactly what was about to happen. A fight wasn't just coming, it had been expected. Picture yourself standing there. Every sound matters. A snapped branch, a distant cry, smoke rising where it shouldn't. In a world without written laws or standing armies, survival could depend on spotting danger a few moments before anyone else. But here's the strange part. For thousands of years, ancient humans lived in small groups scattered across enormous landscapes. They had no nations to defend, no cities to conquer, and often more land than people. If there was room to leave, why stay and fight? Why risk everything in a battle that could wipe out an entire family? That question has puzzled archaeologists for decades. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. People fought over food, water, or territory. Simple enough, except the evidence refuses to stay that simple. Researchers have uncovered skeletons bearing deadly wounds in places where resources were plentiful. Ancient camps were abandoned without signs of starvation. Some groups traveled incredible distances just to confront people they had never met. Think about that for a second. If survival alone can't explain these battles, then what truly drove the first human wars? The most obvious answer is the one almost everyone assumes. Ancient humans fought because they needed to survive. At first, the evidence seems to support it. Imagine two small tribes arriving at the same river during a long, unforgiving dry season. The water is shrinking. Animals gather there to drink. Edible plants grow only along its banks. Whoever controls that narrow stretch of land controls life itself. Suddenly, walking away is no longer an easy choice. Archaeologists have found prehistoric camps clustered around reliable water sources, fertile valleys, and migration routes followed by large herds. These weren't just good places to live. They were the difference between eating and starving. It's not hard to see how a disagreement could turn into violence when every meal depended on the same piece of ground. The same pattern appears across the world, from Ice Age Europe to ancient Australia and the plains of Africa. Early communities repeatedly settled in locations where nature offered its greatest rewards. When those rewards became scarce, tension naturally followed. The logic seems almost unavoidable. Protect your food, defend your family. Fight only when you have no other option. For a long time, many researchers believed that explained everything. And honestly, it sounds convincing. But then something unexpected began to appear. Some of the oldest massacre sites were discovered in places that showed no clear signs of famine or environmental collapse. The land was still productive, water was still available, animals had not disappeared. So why were entire groups dying in violent clashes? That should have confirmed the survival theory. Instead, it created a far more unsettling question. What if the first human wars were driven by something far more complex than simply staying alive? If survival wasn't the whole story, then maybe ancient humans fought to protect their territory. That idea makes sense. Even today, wolves defend their hunting grounds. Chimpanzees patrol the edges of their forests, sometimes launching deadly attacks against neighboring groups. Territory means safety, food, and a better chance to raise the next generation. Humans, after all, are part of the same evolutionary story. For years, many researchers believed our earliest wars were simply an extension of that instinct. Then the evidence became harder to explain. Archaeologists began mapping ancient settlements and migration routes. Instead of finding people trapped inside fixed borders, they found something very different. Many prehistoric groups moved constantly, following the seasons, migrating animals, and changing weather. Their territories often shifted from year to year. If land wasn't permanent, why risk lives defending it? The contradiction grew even stranger. Some skeletons recovered from prehistoric battle sites contained weapons made from stone found hundreds of miles away. Decorative shells from distant coastlines appeared deep inland. Rare pigments traveled across entire regions. These weren't isolated communities cut off from the world. They were connected through surprisingly long networks of travel and exchange. Think about what that means. The same groups who traded valuable materials with distant strangers were sometimes willing to fight them as well. Trade and violence existed side by side. That wasn't what researchers expected. It suggested that early humans didn't simply see outsiders as enemies. Relationships between groups were far more complicated, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, and sometimes changing in ways we still don't fully understand. So, if wars weren't caused only by hunger, and they weren't caused only by territory, then what could make neighboring groups cooperate one season, yet face each other with spears the next? That question would lead archaeologists to one of the most revealing discoveries ever made about the origins of human warfare. The search for that answer took researchers to a quiet stretch of land in northern Kenya. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, just dry earth, scattered stones, and the remains of an ancient lake that had long since disappeared. But beneath the surface lay a scene frozen for nearly 10,000 years. When archaeologists carefully uncovered the skeletons, something immediately stood out. These people hadn't been buried with ceremony, they had fallen where they died. One skeleton still had sharp obsidian blades lodged inside the bones. Another showed deep fractures across the skull, likely caused by a heavy club. Several bodies were discovered face down, their arms twisted into positions that suggested they had died suddenly without any chance to escape. This wasn't a single murder, it looked like the aftermath of an entire attack. The discovery became known as one of the oldest clear pieces of evidence for organized human violence. Researchers expected it to support the familiar story that desperate people had fought over scarce resources, but when they reconstructed the ancient environment, the results didn't fit. The nearby lake had provided fresh water. Fish were plentiful. Wild animals still roamed the surrounding landscape. There was little evidence that this community had been starving or trapped by a collapsing environment. That finding changed everything. If these people weren't fighting because survival left them no choice, then the motive had to be something else. Perhaps the attackers wanted valuable supplies. Perhaps they wanted control of an important meeting place. Or perhaps the victims were targeted simply because they belonged to another group. Instead of solving the mystery, the site opened an even bigger one. What could convince ordinary humans to organize, plan, and carry out violence against complete strangers long before kingdoms, armies, or civilizations ever existed? To get closer to the answer, it helps to stop looking at skeletons and start looking at people. Imagine a young hunter living around 12,000 years ago. He doesn't have a name that history remembers. He isn't a king or a legendary warrior. He's simply a member of a small tribe, waking before sunrise beside a dying campfire. Every face around him is familiar. These aren't just neighbors. They're the people who raised him, shared their food, protected him as a child, and trusted him with their lives. His entire world fits inside this camp. One morning, scouts return with troubling news. Another group has been seen nearby. No one knows exactly why they've come. Maybe they're searching for fresh water. Maybe they're following migrating animals. Or maybe they're the same strangers who were spotted months earlier, watching from a distant hill before quietly disappearing into the trees. The uncertainty is the frightening part. The tribe doesn't know whether these newcomers will arrive carrying gifts or carrying weapons. So everyone prepares for the worst. Spears are sharpened. Children stay close to their mothers. Hunters who normally spread out across the landscape now remain together, quietly watching the horizon. Think about what that does to a person. Fear doesn't need a battle to grow. It only needs the possibility of one. Modern psychology shows that humans naturally become more loyal to their own group whenever they sense an outside threat. Trust inside the tribe grows stronger, while suspicion towards strangers grows deeper. Long before the first spear is thrown, the mind has already divided the world into us and them. And that's what makes this story so important. Perhaps the first wars didn't begin when weapons were raised. Perhaps they began the moment strangers stopped being seen as people and started being seen as a threat. But that only leads to another mystery. If fear could unite a tribe, who or what first taught humans to fear one another? By now, the mystery is beginning to change. This is no longer just a story about ancient humans. It's a story about a pattern that appears almost everywhere in nature. Take chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Deep within the forests of East Africa, researchers spent years quietly observing neighboring chimp communities. At first, Everything seemed peaceful. Then, without warning, small patrols of males would silently cross into another group's territory. If they found a lone rival, they attacked with overwhelming force before slipping back into the forest. It wasn't random violence, it was planned. Think about that for a second. No cities, no governments, no written laws. Yet the basic strategy looked surprisingly familiar. And humans weren't the only ones. Wolves defend the boundaries of their packs. Ant colonies launch organized raids against rival colonies. Even tiny social insects cooperate to overwhelm enemies far larger than themselves. Across completely different species, one pattern keeps repeating. Individuals become stronger when they fight together. But here's where history makes the story even bigger. As humans spread across Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, the scale of conflict changed, but the pattern didn't. Small tribal raids gradually became clashes between villages. Villages grew into chiefdoms. Chiefdoms became kingdoms. And kingdoms eventually raised armies that marched across continents. The weapons transformed from wooden spears to bronze swords, iron shields, gunpowder, and eventually machines capable of destroying entire cities. But the force driving people into battle remained strangely familiar: a shared identity, a common enemy, a belief that protecting our people justified fighting theirs. The battlefield grew larger, yet the psychology hardly changed. And that's the unsettling realization. The first human wars may never have truly ended. They simply evolved alongside civilization. But if cooperation and conflict have always grown together, then one final question remains. What explains the moments when humans chose not to fight, even when every reason to go to war seemed to be there? If war was such a natural part of human history, you'd expect every ancient society to be locked in constant conflict. But that's not what the evidence shows. In fact, some groups spent generations living alongside their neighbors with surprisingly little violence. One remarkable example comes from prehistoric Europe, where archaeologists have uncovered settlements connected by long-distance trade rather than defensive walls. Communities exchanged obsidian, amber, shells, and rare pigments across hundreds of miles. These valuable items passed from group to group, proving that strangers weren't always seen as enemies. Sometimes they were partners. The same pattern appears among many hunter-gatherer societies studied in more recent history. Instead of fighting over territory, neighboring bands often met during certain seasons to exchange goods, arrange marriages, celebrate rituals, and strengthen alliances. Relationships that could have ended in bloodshed were transformed into cooperation. Why? Because peace could be just as valuable as victory. A trusted neighbor meant access to new resources during hard times. Marriage between different groups reduced conflict and strengthened survival. Trade offered benefits that no raid could provide. In other words, ancient humans weren't trapped by violence. They constantly weighed the costs. If cooperation promised more than war, they chose cooperation. If war promised more than peace, they chose war. That makes the story far more complicated than many people imagine. Our ancestors weren't driven by blind aggression alone. They were making decisions. And that raises one final mystery before everything comes together. If the same human mind could create lasting peace or organized warfare, what was the invisible force that tipped the balance from one to the other? The biggest surprise is that ancient humans didn't invent war. They invented something far more powerful. They invented large-scale cooperation. At first, that sounds backwards. But think about every clue we've uncovered. Food alone couldn't explain the violence. Territory wasn't always the answer. Even fear wasn't enough. After all, many animals defend themselves without organizing coordinated attacks involving dozens of individuals. Humans became different because they learned to cooperate with people who weren't immediate family. That changed everything. Anthropologists believe our greatest evolutionary advantage was never sharper teeth or greater strength. It was the ability to build trust, share stories, divide responsibilities, and act as one group. A single hunter was vulnerable. 20 hunters working together could bring down animals many times their size. The same ability that made cooperation possible also made organized warfare possible. Once people believed they belonged to the same tribe, they could defend one another. Once they shared the same stories, they could fight for the same cause. Once they trusted the same leaders, they could coordinate attacks with remarkable precision. War wasn't a separate invention. It was cooperation turned toward conflict. That's why human warfare became unlike anything seen elsewhere in nature. Weapons certainly mattered, but the real weapon was the human mind. It could persuade dozens, or eventually millions, of complete strangers to act as if they were one family. That's how small tribal raids eventually became vast armies marching under the same symbols, the same beliefs, and the same purpose. The battlefield kept changing, the psychology behind it did not. And suddenly the title has a different meaning. The question isn't simply how ancient humans waged war. They used spears, clubs, bows, and carefully planned ambushes. The deeper answer is why they were able to wage war at all, because the very ability that allowed humans to build villages, civilizations, and empires, the extraordinary power to cooperate with one another, also gave them the ability to fight together. In the end, the first human weapon wasn't stone, it was unity. Return to that quiet valley. The morning mist still hangs over the hills. The sharpened spears are still clutched in trembling hands. Two small groups face one another, waiting for someone to make the first move. For a brief moment, nothing happens. History balances on a single decision. One step forward could begin a battle, one step back could begin a friendship. That choice has followed humanity ever since. Across thousands of years, the weapons have changed beyond recognition, but the minds holding them remain remarkably familiar. The same instincts that once gathered strangers around a campfire to hunt, build shelters, and protect children also gave them the power to unite against another group. That's the paradox of being human. Our greatest strength has never been our intelligence alone. It has been our ability to stand together. Civilization was built by cooperation, so was warfare, and perhaps that's the lesson hidden beneath the oldest battlefields on Earth. They don't simply tell us how our ancestors fought. They remind us that every generation inherits the same extraordinary gift, the ability to choose who belongs to us. The future has always depended on what happens next, because the most powerful weapon humans have ever carried was never a spear, a sword, or a gun. It was the decision to stand side by side.